Stewardship is not performance. Stewardship is not about what the numbers is. The stewardship is not about how much money is in your bank account. Stewardship is not about the amount of things you were able to accomplish today on your to-do list. That is not what stewardship is. Stewardship is not about the accomplishment that your kids, the schools they got into. That is not an indicator of how well you stewarded over the family and children that God gave you. It's just not. Stewardship is about if you listened to God and went to God and abided and were obedient to what God told you to do with your kids. You're so busy trying to get your kids into an Ivy League school when God designed your kid to be a worship leader at this church, and he don't need an Ivy League education to do that. He might need to go to a Bible college. But you so busy trying to steward and perform to a worldly standard, and that's not what God planned for your child. Hey y'all, my name is Rachel and I'm the host of Abiding Every Day, where we exist to demystify connecting with God and guide the chronic overachiever in their journey of abiding every day in Christ with faith by sharing practical steps and systems for success that are aligned with God's word. Welcome back. We are still in our biblical concept series. Today we are talking about stewardship, which is kind of a biblical word. It's a real churchy word, but it is also a worldly word as well. People use, stewardship is a thing in like business and things like that as well. Today I'm going to be talking about stewardship, what it is and what it ain't, because we be getting confused, because God just showed me the other day how I was confused about what stewardship is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into that, like always, follow me on Instagram, Rach_the_great, and our podcast page at Abiding Every Day, and the Tag Bible App Challenge. That is a challenge where we as a community are engaging in shared devotionals. I picked the devotionals in the YouVersion Bible app, and we read them and go through them every day with each other. We're doing that through the end of this year, and we talk, we commune, we give advice, we share our revelations. Right now, we're actually doing a 2-week social media fast. So we do a lot of things in there. The main thing that we do, though, is the shared devotionals every day. So sign up, link is in the description box, show notes, also in the bio on my Instagram pages. And now we're going to get into today's episode. So stewardship. I looked up the basic kind of Webster's definition of stewardship, and it says stewardship is the conducting, supervising, or managing of something. So stewarding, how you steward your money, how you steward your time, how you steward your talents, how you steward your resources, how you steward your family, all of them things. That's the idea of stewardship. And I'm going to read a pretty well-known parable in Luke that Jesus gave, and then we are going to get into kind of lessons from that parable and how that applies to stewardship and what stewardship is and what it ain't. So what I'm reading from is Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30. So it says, "Again, the kingdom of heaven can be illustrated by the story of a man going on a long trip. He called together his servants and entrusted his money to them while he was gone. He gave 5 bags of silver to one, 2 bags of silver to another, and 1 bag of silver to the last, dividing it in proportion to their abilities. He then left on his trip. The servant who received 5 bags of silver began to invest the money and earned 5 more. The servant with 2 bags of silver also went to work and earned 2 more. But the servant who received the 1 bag of silver dug a hole in the ground and hid the master's money. After a long time, their master returned from his trip and called them to give an account of how they had used his money. The servant to whom he had entrusted the 5 bags of silver came forward with 5 more and said, 'Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 5 more.' The master was full of praise. 'Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together." The servant who had received the 2 bags of silver came forward and said, "Master, you have gave me 2 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 2 more." The master said, "Well done, my good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in handling this small amount, so now I will give you many more responsibilities. Let's celebrate together." Then the servant with the 1 bag of silver came and said, "Master, I knew you were a harsh man, harvesting crops you didn't plant and gathering crops you didn't cultivate. I was afraid I would lose your money, so I hid it in the earth. Look, here is your money back." But the master replied, "You wicked and lazy servant. If you knew I harvested crops I didn't plant and gathered crops I didn't cultivate, why didn't you deposit my money in the bank? At least I could have gotten some interest on it." Then he ordered, "Take the money from this servant and give it to the one with the 10 bags of silver. To those who use well what they are given, even more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who do nothing, even what little they have will be taken away. Now throw this useless servant into outer darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So that's a pretty popular parable. You understand the main point of it from reading it. But how this applies to stewardship. So I'm going to give you 3 things about what stewardship is and what it's not. So the first thing is stewardship is not performance. And this is the revelation that God gave me a few days ago, because I have been personally feeling kind of overwhelmed with all the things I have to do and handle and take care of. I work full time. I'm in school and I do this podcast. I have the girls in the devotional group. I coordinate that, make sure they're all good, all those things. And I just have a house. I have a dog, all the things I have in person, all the things I have to take care of. And I have been a little overwhelmed, and I've been trying to I just want to make sure I'm doing things the right way, doing them in excellence, doing them in a way that God will be pleased, giving excellence in each area that God has called me to at this point. I don't want to drop the ball on something. I don't want to not grow what God gave me. Like if we're talking about the talents, I don't want to come back and say I only got the one, I didn't grow it. I didn't invest it and grow it. And so I've been kind of feeling that way. But I was reading actually one of the devotionals from the challenge that we were reading this week. And she was talking about success and obedience, how success is obedience is the title of the devotional. And we're called to steward well what God gave us, but we're not called to perform and strive for a certain outcome. We're just supposed to be obedient to what God told us to do. And for me, I was like, wow, I really have been confusing stewardship and performance. I have been thinking that in order to steward something well that God has given me, I have to be excelling in that area according to my own standards or according to a worldly standard of excelling. I need to be the best. I need to be doing X amount of whatever measurements I'm giving myself. I'm not actually assessing myself by my faith, like we talked about last week. I'm trying to assess my stewardship by my performance indicators, by my numbers of followers, by my numbers of listeners, by my grades, by my feelings of if I'm doing things good or not. That's how I'm trying to assess my stewardship, by my performance, when stewardship is really assessing it by your faith, like we talked about last week. It really is. God has called us to do the things, be obedient and be faithful and walk out our faith and stewarded the things that he's given us. But he's not calling us to, that doesn't apply to our performance or having a particular outcome like we talked about last week. At the end of last week, the outcome, God's intended outcome may look completely different than what we think it's going to look like. God told me to start the podcast. He didn't tell me I need to have X amount of listeners by month 3. That's just something that I'm attaching to the thing he told me to do. That's an outcome that I'm attaching to the thing he told me to do that he didn't attach there. God rarely attaches a specific outcome to the thing he told you to do. And that's just in my experience. Like, that ain't what God said to do. He didn't say you need to have X amount of listeners. He didn't even tell me the podcast needed to be successful by a worldly standard and reach a whole bunch of people. He just told me to do it. His intended outcome for the podcast may just be me getting used to putting messages together, me getting used to talking to people, me getting used to doing this because I may need that in some other area of life. He may not even care about how many people the podcast reaches. Like, that may not be a part of his plan. You know what I'm saying? So we sit there and attach our worldly outcomes to what God gave us to do. And then we try to measure our stewardship basically by our performance about how we're getting to those outcomes versus measuring our stewardship by our faith. So stewardship and performance are not the same thing. And if I'm tying it back to the parable, the person who earned the 2 extra versus the person who earned the 5 extra. So the master said the exact same thing to both of them when they reported their results. The person who had 5, they came back with 5 extra. The person who had 2, they came back with 2 extra. And the master said, "Well done, my good and faithful servant," to both of those people. So the person who did 2, it wasn't for them to have 5. It was for them to get 2. And at the beginning of the parable, it says he gave them the amount of talents according to their abilities. So God already, if God calls us to do something and tells us to do something, he already has measured out our ability and our aptitude for whatever he's calling us to do. So if the person who had 2 was like, "Oh, okay, I have 2, but that person, they're going to have 5. I need to try to get these 5. Then they're not stewarding what God gave them according to the abilities that God has placed in them. They are striving to be like the person that had 5 when they're not the person who had 5. They're the person who had 2. So it's not about having the highest performance. It's about stewarding and walking by faith and doing what God has called us to do. And then the last thing, if that person that had 2 was trying to strive to get the 5 instead of the 2, what makes us think, number one, that we know what the outcome God intends for us? What makes them think like, "Oh, I'm supposed to get 5 instead of 2, be based on somebody else getting 5. So now we're ascribing somebody else's outcome to the outcome that God didn't tell us. So that's the first problem. Then 2, what makes us think that we even can strive and perform enough to get to that outcome without God? Like, once we get into looking at what other people have and trying to measure up ourselves against a worldly standard, we get into striving, point blank. Like, you get out of walking by faith when you try to ascribe certain outcomes to what God told you to do when he didn't say that. So now if you're trying to reach that outcome that God never called you to reach, now you're striving and assuming that your striving is going to get the outcome anyway. Like, if that wasn't in your aptitude or ability or in God's plan for you, 9 times out of 10, you're not finna get that outcome, because that was not in God's plan for you to have the outcome. God literally doesn't need our help. Like, whatever his intended outcome is, as long as we're faithful and obedient to what he tells us to do, there's nothing we can strive and get by striving and by thinking we need to do what somebody else has done that is going to get us to where God wants us to be, or more than what God wants us to be. Like, there's no way for us to really do that, because we are finite human beings and God does not need our help. He chooses to do things through us, but he does not need our help, period, point blank. So that's that. Stewardship is not performance. Stewardship is not about what the numbers is. The stewardship is not about how much money is in your bank account. Stewardship is not about the amount of things you were able to accomplish today on your to-do list. That is not what stewardship is. Stewardship is not about the accomplishment that your kids, the schools they got into. That is not an indicator of how well you stewarded over the family and children that God gave you. It's just not. Stewardship is about if you listened to God and went to God and abided and were obedient to what God told you to do with your kids. You're so busy trying to get your kids into an Ivy League school when God designed your kid to be a worship leader at this church, and he don't need an Ivy League education to do that. He might need to go to a Bible college. But you so busy trying to steward and perform to a worldly standard, and that's not what God planned for your child. But we want to make our own plans and say, look, God, look how well I stewarded what you gave me. Look how well I performed. Look how well I measured up against worldly standards. And that didn't have nothing to do with what God gave you and how God wanted you to steward. That didn't have nothing to do with it. So we have to get out of the mindset that stewardship is performance. And that just blew my mind this week of like, girl, you've been thinking about this wrong this whole time. Performance is not stewardship. Stewardship is not performance, because God's thoughts are so higher than ours. Like, his perfect outcome for your life will more than likely look completely different than a worldly standard for a perfect life, than the person next to you standard for a perfect life. God has a plan for each one of us. What makes us think that we can just ascribe whatever outcomes we want to what God has told us to do or what God has given us? We are to just follow what God said and be obedient to where he's leading us, even if it looks funky, even if we don't understand it. So I'm going to get off of that soapbox, but that was just like a mind-blowing thing to me. And I really wanted to share that with you all, because like, we be so backwards out here. We be backwards. Like, God may not even want my podcast to be successful by a worldly podcast standard and have all these advertisers. Now, I don't think God's outcome for me to just be out here failing at everything. That's not how he set things up. But it may be I have a small audience, and that's his plan for this, because he just wants me to get used to doing this on a weekly basis, because this is going to set me up for something else he wants me to do later on in life. It may not be like, this is not the end all be all. This is what he has me doing right now. And so if I'm acting like this is the end all be all and trying to reach certain goals with an end all, thinking something as an end all be all, when he has so much more for it. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not still trying to position my show to do well. It doesn't mean I don't look into marketing and how to market well and how to reach more people. That is fine to do, but that is not I am not doing those things to reach a certain performance goal that God didn't tell me to reach. So that is that. Stewardship is not performance. Number 2 is that stewardship is obedience. So it's not performance, but it is obedience. And I've kind of already said that. But it's just doing what God told you to do. And then I go back to the parable, the servant who buried the talent. The reason he was wicked and not a good, unfaithful servant was because it didn't explicitly say that in this parable, but in another version of it, and it implies it in this parable, that the master who left, he gave the servants the talents and told them to invest it. The servant who he entrusted 5 bags of silver, he came forward with 5 more and said, "Master, you gave me 5 bags of silver to invest, and I have earned 5 more." So that implies that he gave them that money and told them to invest it, because he said, "You gave me this to invest." He didn't just make it up that he was supposed to invest it and grow it. So he told all of them the same thing. The other servant said the same thing. "You gave me these 2 talents to invest." So those were the instructions to invest the money. But the servant who buried it did not invest the money. Like, He was not obedient. That was the reason that he was not a good and faithful servant. The reason the master called him wicked was not just because he gave back to him what he already had. It was because he did not invest it. He was like, you didn't even put the money in the bank so I can get interest on it. Like, I gave you this and told you to invest it, to invest so I can make more money. And so you decided to bury my money instead of investing it like I told you to, or at least putting it in the bank so I can get some interest and earn a little bit more back than what I gave you. If I wanted my money to just sit there, and if I wanted to have the same amount of money I had before I left, I would have just kept the money in my own stuff instead of giving it to you to invest with the instructions to invest. So that is why that servant was not a good and faithful servant, not because he didn't bring anything back. Because like I said, the servant who got 2 more and the servant who got 5 more, those are different amounts, but they still got the same praise. It wasn't about the amount. It was about the fact that they were obedient and invested. So that's that. Stewardship is obedience. It is doing what God told you to do. It is not performing to a certain outcome that you think is the best outcome. It's not being the best of the best. It's not being perfect by a worldly standard. It is about obeying what God told you to do. Third point is stewardship is abiding with faith. That's what this whole platform is about. Stewardship is about abiding with your faith. It's about being obedient. It's about walking out that faith cycle, confidence, obedience, and realization. The servant who buried the talent did not have faith. He said, I was scared I would lose your money. He didn't have faith. God gave us these abilities. God gave us a word. Just like me with this podcast. God gave me and continues to give me things to say on here. And if I said, well, I wasn't sure if I was going to say it right. I wasn't sure if I could learn how to record. I wasn't sure if I was going to say something wrong. I wasn't sure if I was going to have a lot of ums, which I'd be doing anyway. And so I didn't tell the people what you said. I know you gave me the word, but I didn't give it to anybody because I wasn't sure about how it was going to sound. I didn't think I could do it well enough. I didn't think it would sound good. I don't have faith in what God gave me. If I have something from God and I know that God is God, it don't matter about how bad I can mess it up. He's still going to get his plans accomplished through whatever he told me to say. It don't matter if I have all the ums in the world. And that's not to say that I shouldn't try to improve my communication skills, those types of things. Like, that is a part of stewardship. That's not the performance of stewardship, of trying to be the best of the best. But it is about, okay, God gave me these things to say. And I'm going to be faithful and I'm going to say them. But I know I struggle in this area. So I'm going to work on that so I can make sure that I am, doing what God told me to do and I'm doing it well. I'm doing just a little something extra to do it well. That's fine. That's not striving for this certain performance goal or thinking you need to do this, that, and the other, prescribing certain outcomes to it. So that is a part of stewardship. I don't do this that well, but I know that God has called me to do this, and I know that I can do it well because he has called me to do it. Point blank, that is a point blank. I can do it well because he called me to do it. And so I'm going to get on this mic. I'm going to practice, and I'm going to just continue to do it every week. I'm going to get on LinkedIn Learning and take some communication courses and learn how to better communicate so that I can make sure that I'm continuing and progressing and doing well what God called me to do. That is stewardship. That is having faith. You start with the faith. You don't start with, oh, I need to be this, that, and that, and the other to do this well and get the performance and meet this goal and be the best and have X amount of listeners. Like, that's not how you start. You start with the faith. Okay, God called me to do this, so that means I can do it. I'm starting from a place of confidence, and then I get into my obedience, and then in my obedience, I set my little goals and tasks like we talked about last week. Like, okay, God, I'm going to improve my communication this way because I already know I can do this because you called me to do it. But I know I have resources available to me. So I'm going to study and learn how to do it well so I can make sure that I'm doing what you called me to do well. That's stewardship. It's not, oh, okay, to do this thing that God told me to do, I need to do X, Y, and Z. And then by X, Y, and Z, I need to have X, Y, and Z. And then A, B, C will be good. That's my outcome. That's not stewardship. Stewardship is not performance. Stewardship is obedience. And stewardship is abiding with faith, having faith in what God called you to do, having faith that if God called me to do it, that means I can do it. The servant in that parable buried the talent because he was afraid. Faith and fear do not go together. Not to say that you ain't gonna be scared when you walking out your faith, because you might be. But we don't let fear stop us from walking out our faith and being obedient to what God said. And we don't let fear discount our faith in what God said we can do and said who we are and what his promises are in his word. And abiding with faith is not striving to perform. It's not letting fear stop us. It's not striving to be this, that, and the other to some performance goal. It is walking out our faith in our obedience. That is what stewardship is. Stewardship is not performance. Stewardship is obedience. And stewardship is abiding with faith. Point blank. That was my revelation for the week. And I think it's important. I think those of us who are overachievers, who want to do things well and excellence and perfectionists, we get caught up in stewardship and performance. We act like a certain outcome or a certain performance or a certain feeling that we're doing things well. Like, that's what I've been getting caught up in. Oh, I'm not stewarding this well because I don't feel like I'm doing it well. Like, girl, what does that even mean? Like, are you being obedient? Are you walking out your faith? Then you're stewarding it well. That's it. It's not about how you feel if you're doing it well. Are you doing it? Start there. Are you doing it? Do you have faith that God told you to do this and that because God told you to do this, it's going to go well? Then that's stewarding. You are stewarding well. So that's all for this week. Follow me on Instagram, Rach_the_great at Abiding Every Day. Sign up for the Tag Bible app challenge. Link in the description box in the show notes and link in my bios on Instagram. And I'll see y'all next week. Peace.